Well, hello folks out there in YouTube land. Got a very interesting show for you. Yep, a list of candidates that Fulmer was considering to replace Jeremy Pruitt. This is something that just came out, and the Knoxville News Sentinel, Adam Sparks got this. The Knoxville News Sentinel did a Freedom of Information Act, and they got this email and all this list. This has been a very interesting story. I didn't realize there was already a list of candidates that Fulmer was considering during the whole Jeremy Pruitt saga, especially towards the end. And it's got some intriguing stuff in it, and we're going to go over the list of candidates and discuss all this. But man, this was a very interesting story. And kudos to Adam Sparks. He has done some fantastic work on this. I mean, there are still some very real journalists out there. I mentioned the other day, Brent Hubbs was doing some fantastic work, also Adam Sparks. So it's really nice to see that level of journalism out there. And the News Sentinel has done they've done fantastic. And here's the story. It says, Philip Fulmer, 16 candidates to replace Jeremy Pruitt at Tennessee, revealed in an email. And it's this thinking in the final days of Jeremy Pruitt's Tennessee football tenure, it was revealed. And he had 16 candidates that ranged from Hugh Freeze to a guy named Alex French. It talks about how, now one thing I want to talk about a little bit. I know some of you don't like Philip Fulmer. Look, I do. I've liked him. I thought he was a great coach in the 90s. And here's the thing. I was there when Johnny Majors was head coach. I really like Johnny Majors too. You can like Johnny Majors and like Philip Fulmer. You don't have to choose. When I was there, I remember Johnny Majors well because he was old school, man. And let me show you what I looked like back then. Yep, there I was right there. That's Gibby Gilbert and Tom Smith. And I was about 160 pounds. I was about 6'2", 160 pounds, skinny as a rail. And anyway, I remember the players coming in from practice, and these guys were mammoth, okay? Even back then in the 80s, they were anywhere from 250 to 300 pounds, most of them. And their practices must have been absolutely brutal because I would come in with my golf bag, my visor, and all this crap. You know, like I said, I'd just go and hit golf balls or played golf or whatever. So I put my clubs next to me in the elevator, and 2 or 3 of these big guys would walk in fresh out of practice. And I'm telling you, they looked like they had been beaten. They were worn out, could barely stand, and they would always lean against the elevator. They just couldn't hold their own weight. And they would look at me, and every time, I mean, it was almost like clockwork. Man, I should have played golf. Majors was just that way. You know, he would just practice you and practice you. So anyway, I remember those days well. And then Philip Fulmer came in and took the program up another notch. Johnny had sort of gotten it squared away and it was good. And then Fulmer came in and took it up another notch. So I liked them both. So this is not I'm not going to be mean to Philip Fulmer over his tenure because, yes, he shouldn't have hired Jeremy Pruitt, but also realize we'd already gone through a list of about a dozen guys that would not come, because we were in a absolute free fall. We had not hired Greg Schiano. That blew up into a big mess. The national media was attacking us left and right. And so they were trying to scare off all other coaches and to try to kind of harm us, really, at that point. That was my opinion anyway. So he had a very short list of guys that would even consider it that were at a certain level. And I remember Jeremy Pruitt, he was like the best defensive coordinator in the country at the time, or certainly the best reputation. But unfortunately for him, he obviously didn't interview well. That was his personality. And that's probably why he hadn't gotten a head coaching job prior to that. So anyway, Philip Fulmer hired him. And then towards the end of Jeremy Pruitt's tenure, his 3 years, there was obviously problems had come out. And Fulmer had put together an email, an assessment of the program, and he wasn't convinced yet that they needed to fire Pruitt, but he was obviously thinking about it, and also coaches that would be available and what would be the best hires for Tennessee. So that's where this email comes in. And here are some of the candidates that he was considered. He had former UT quarterback T. Martin, Auburn coach Hugh Freeze, Florida coach Billy Napier, and Shane Beamer were on that list of 16. Also talked about a coach named Alex French, and that may have been something where he got the name wrong because nobody knows who that is. And it also had additional revelations about Fulmer's state of mind during the early stages of the investigation. I don't think they knew how serious it was at that point. And the email was written to UT Chancellor Donde Plowman. It was a rough draft in response to her questions about the football program amid allegations of the egregious infractions and his plan if Pruitt was fired. The email was instead sent to Caitlin Hardy, who was Fulmer's assistant director. So I'm assuming he probably wanted her to look at it and kind of maybe talk to him about it. So some of the email appears to have been written in late November of 2020, but not sent to Hardy until January. So it was really early on. So there's no available record of Plowman ever receiving the email. And the email was titled Football Appraisal. And Fulmer at that point was still arguing that Pruitt should be retained. And he says, I am not at all advocating a change in football and hope we do not get there with pending issues. He said, I do believe we can overcome our challenges and I have seen signs of progress. So obviously he was off base on that. And I know this was early on, so, it's a good thing that Pruitt was not kept on because that would have made things 10 times worse. Said Fulmer closed the email with a list of potential candidates and again realized this was a rough draft and had not even gone to Plowman. Said some intriguing observations that ultimately led to UT hiring Josh Heupel. Said he considered Hugh Freeze, but he was concerned about his baggage. Said at the time Freeze was rebuilding his reputation at Liberty, and that, if you remember, Freeze, and I'm sure you remember this, he resigned at Ole Miss during a really bad scandal, and Ole Miss had tried to protect him and keep him, and they just couldn't do it. It was too much, and there was ladies of the night involved and all kinds of stuff. So it just wasn't. It was a really bad situation. So I think that would have been a bad hire at the time. I still think he's going to win at Auburn, but you take on that baggage. Billy Napier was another Alabama coach that was considered. Billy Napier is now at Florida. I would not have been real thrilled with that hire. That would have been another hire out of Louisiana. I think it was Louisiana Tech, but at least he'd won there. When we hired Dooley was like 4-8. Who hires a coach that's 4-8? I remember I was talking to my brother, Junebug, about it at the time, and I said, what do you think of this Dooley guy? And he said, he loses. The guy's a losing coach. Why are we hiring this dude? But we were so desperate after Lane Kiffin basically left in the middle of the night. It was like the night before or the day before signing day, which totally killed us. So we had 24 hours to find a coach. That's why I always give Lane Kiffin so much grief, because he did the worst thing he could have done to us. First of all, to leave after 1 year after he was treated like gold, but then to leave the day before signing day is the worst day of the year that you could possibly leave a team. He didn't care. He didn't care. So when I give him grief, that's why. And said Fulmer knew hiring a coach that had ties to Alabama could be dicey. We don't know about Napier. Napier might turn out to be a really good coach, but he was 6-7 last year, and I'm not impressed with his on-field coaching, certainly not against the Vols. He really left some points on the board on the field, but we'll see how he does. He's been recruiting really well. You should be able to recruit at Florida. T. Martin, who was a Pruitt assistant, was a curious option. That wouldn't have worked because he had been an assistant for Pruitt, and that just wouldn't have worked. Said, we know that T. Martin was the quarterback of the national title team, and said his statue sits outside Neyland Stadium. He did a fantastic job as quarterback. You remember when he had 27 receptions in a row? He was very accurate and a great runner, and he was clutch. He was really good under pressure. But again, you couldn't have hired him if he was an assistant under Pruitt. The NCAA wouldn't have gone for that. I'm not saying that T. Martin did anything wrong. He probably didn't, but that just wouldn't have worked. And it says right there, Martin was Pruitt's assistant head coach in 19 and 20. So obviously Fulmer did not really understand how serious of a nature the violations were. So he just wasn't, I think Fulmer was in the dark. I really do. And that email suggests it. Shane Beamer, Justin Wilcox. Beamer was on the list, but he was hired by South Carolina in 2020. And he knew Beamer. He said he coached for him. He'd served as a UT graduate. Wilcox was also on the list. He had served as a defensive coordinator from 2010 to 11 under Derek Dooley. Bill O'Brien, who had been the head coach of the Houston Texans, and I think he wound up at Alabama, and then where else did he go? Yeah, that's right. Nick Saban hired him as an offensive coordinator. Then he left to become New England Patriots offensive coordinator. Okay. Will Healy and the rest of the candidates thought he was young and dynamic. At Austin Peay, Healy was the National Coach of the Year. He was fired after 4 seasons at Charlotte. Here was the rest of his list. Luke Fickell at Cincinnati. Man, that would have been a good hire. Luke Fickell's a heck of a coach. Matt Campbell's always a popular name that gets thrown around. Army coach Jeff Monken. Interesting. Utah State, Blake Anderson. He was at Arkansas State at the time. Liberty coach Jamie Chadwell. He was at Coastal Carolina. Virginia coach Tony Elliott, who was the offensive coordinator at Clemson. I'm sure he was a hot coach back then. Duke coach Mike Elko, and I'm sure that was his connection to his offensive coordinator that, what was his name? Yeah, David Cutcliffe, who was a great offensive coordinator for us. And actually, he had led the team on the offense our national championship year. And then, assistant coach took over because he took over at Duke, I believe. No, it was Ole Miss. Went to Ole Miss. So anyway, and now I cannot remember that guy's name, but he's the head coach at East Tennessee State. And then they also considered Buffalo Bills quarterbacks coach Joe Brady, then Carolina Panthers offensive coordinator. So he had a list of 16 names as possible replacements for Jeremy Pruitt, but based on that email, which was very early on, I guess he wanted to try to ride it out after a 3-7 season. But with all those problems, and it got worse and it got worse, and then Fulmer resigned, which was the best thing he could do. And I guess they let him have some saving grace by doing that. And I know some people don't like that. I get it. Calm down. But anyway, I thought that was very interesting to get that email and see all those that list of names, and also to kind of see what Fulmer was thinking back then, November of 2020. That was super early on. The end of the season was almost upon us. So, he probably had no clue how bad it was and all the payoffs and all that kind of stuff. So I just thought this was super interesting article by Adam Sparks, and kind of gives you that behind-the-scenes inside look.
Oh, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
But I can tell you this much. It couldn't have worked out any better for us getting Danny White as a new athletic director who has just done a fantastic job. I could not be more pleased. The hiring of Josh Heupel, which I initially was against. I didn't think he was going to be that good. I was wrong.
I was not exactly right.
Yeah, I was more than not exactly right. I was wrong. He's turned out to be fantastic. And our basketball team's doing well. Our baseball team's doing well. The women's sports, basketball, softball is doing well. I just think it's all going really the way we want it to. So everything kind of worked out in the end the way we, better than we could have hoped. And hopefully it continues down this path. Just keep Danny White as athletic director, keep our coaches squared away. And I think we're fine. I really couldn't be more excited. And then next year we got the 12-team playoff, which, man, you talking about exciting. That 12-team playoff is going to be so viewed. The views and the millions and tens of millions of views they're going to get off of those games is going to be incredible. It's going to make an unbelievable amount of money for the teams and the NCAA and all that good stuff. So anyway, if you like this content, be sure to hit that like button. Lets me know to continue to cover the Vols and all things SEC. If you've not subscribed, it's on your right, my left. Just hit that little button. I'd appreciate it. And right over here's the most recent video. Be sure to check that out. We'll see you next time on Sports Talk Jay.